Hello, welcome to Sleepless Veteran. If you're here to rest, to let your mind settle while learning something quietly, you've found the right place. We tell military history slowly, without urgency, without drama, just facts unfolding at a pace that lets you breathe, that lets you process, that lets you drift if you need to. Tonight, we're going to Stalingrad, to the winter of 1942 and 1943, to the ruins of a city on the Volga River, to one of the most catastrophic battles in human history. But we're not going to tell the story of the battle itself. Not the fighting in the factories, not the street-by-street combat, not the heroic defense or the desperate assault. Those stories have been told, are known, are documented extensively. Tonight we're telling different story, quieter story, more terrible story perhaps. We're telling the story of what happened after the fighting stopped being about victory, after it became about survival, after an army became trapped, after 300,000 men found themselves surrounded, cut off, dying slowly. This is the story of the German 6th Army in its final months. From November 1942, when the trap closed, through December, when hope flickered, through January, when hope died, to February, when surrender came. This is story of how army died. Not quickly in battle, slowly through cold, through hunger, through disease, through conditions that killed more than combat, through suffering that tested limits of human endurance. This is story told through numbers, through temperatures, through rations, through radio messages, through the mathematics of catastrophe, through the arithmetic of death. This is not story with heroes, has no victories, has no triumph. Is story of suffering, of endurance, of dying, of 300,000 men who entered a pocket around Stalingrad, of 91,000 who surrendered, of 5,000 who eventually came home. Is story of the 295,000 who didn't, who died in the cold, in the hunger, in the ruins, in the camps. Is story of catastrophe, of the destruction of an army, of death on scale that is difficult to comprehend, that numbers can barely capture, that words struggle to describe. So settle in, get comfortable. What follows is calm, is steady, is documentary examination of catastrophe, of suffering, of death. We'll begin with the end, with surrender, with the moment when it was over. Then we'll work backward. We'll understand how it came to this, how trap closed, how promise was false, how cold killed, how hunger killed, how hope died, how army died. We'll follow the decline, the deterioration, the death, through the experiences of those who were there, through the numbers that documented it, through the radio messages that recorded it, through the evidence that remains. This is the story of the last hours of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad, the hours that were months, the death that was slow, the catastrophe that was documented, that is remembered, that is told here. Let's begin. Not at the beginning, at the end, at the moment of surrender, at the conclusion that we will then explain, at the end that demands understanding how it came to be. The surrender, the end, the moment when 300,000 became 91,000, when an army ceased to exist, when Stalingrad ended. Let's begin. The basement of the Wehrmacht department store in Stalingrad. February 1st, 1943. Early morning, the building above was ruins, was shattered by months of combat, by artillery bombardment that had pulverized the structure, by bombs that had fallen continuously, by fighting that had raged through every floor, by destruction that was total, that was complete, that had reduced grand department store to rubble, to ruins, to hollow shell. The building that had been Stalingrad's finest store, that had been symbol of Soviet commercial achievement, that had been shopping destination, was now ruins, was destruction, was evidence of months of brutal combat. The Wehrmacht, That stood near Red Square, near center of Stalingrad. That had been fought over. That had changed hands. That had been destroyed. That was now just ruins, just rubble, just evidence of what war does to cities. The basement was one of few intact spaces, was below ground, was protected by rubble above, was shelter from artillery, from bombs, from fire, from everything. The basement that was cold, was dark, was damp, was unpleasant, but was intact, was functional, was refuge. The basement where German command had established headquarters, where Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus had positioned himself, where staff of 6th Army worked, where radio operators maintained communication, where maps showed shrinking pocket, where commanders tried to maintain control, to maintain army, to maintain function. The basement that was headquarters, that was command center, that was heart of dying army, that was where decisions were made, where orders were given, where army was commanded, such as it could be commanded, such as command meant anything. In final days, in final hours, the basement, that was refuge, that was headquarters, that was where Paulus waited, where staff waited, where command structure waited. For end, that was coming, that was inevitable, that was here. Soviet soldiers entered the basement in the morning hours, descended stairs, found German headquarters, found Paulus, found staff, found officers, found command structure of 6th Army, the Soviet soldiers who were victors, who were conquerors, who were accepting surrender, who were taking prisoners, who were ending battle. The entry that was not violent, was not combat, was not battle, was simply soldiers entering, finding Germans, accepting surrender, taking prisoners, the Soviets who entered basement, who found Paulus at desk, who found staff working, who found headquarters functioning. To the extent anything functioned, in final moments, in final hours, the Soviet entry, that was end, that was conclusion, that was final act. Paulus surrendered to Soviet Colonel Vinogradov, surrendered to relatively junior officer, was captured by regiment that reached headquarters, was taken prisoner by Soviets who found him, the surrender that was formal, was official, was end of command. Paulus, who gave up command of 6th Army, who ceased to be commander, who became prisoner, who handed over authority, who accepted capture, who surrendered, the surrender that was quiet, that was undramatic, that was without heroics, that was simply end. Simply conclusion, simply final act of commander whose army had been destroyed, who had presided over catastrophe, who had commanded death, who had tried to save what he could, who now surrendered, who became prisoner, who ended command, the surrender in basement, to Soviet colonel, in morning of February 1st, that was end of southern pocket, that concluded fighting in city center, that ended resistance in Stalingrad proper. The northern pocket held out one more day. The German forces north of Stalingrad, in industrial areas, in factories, in ruins, who were cut off from southern pocket, who fought separately, who held separately, who surrendered separately. The northern pocket that resisted one more day, that fought one more day, that held one more day. Until February 2nd, when resistance ceased, when fighting stopped, when surrender came, the northern pocket, that was commanded by General Strecker, who surrendered February 2nd, who gave up command, who became prisoner, the surrender that completed capitulation of 6th Army. That ended Battle of Stalingrad. That concluded fighting, that stopped resistance, that ended everything. The surrender on February 2nd, that was final, that was complete, that was absolute. That ended battle that had raged for months, that had destroyed city, that had killed hundreds of thousands, that had been among most brutal battles in human history. The surrender, February 2nd, that ended it, that concluded it, that finished it. Approximately 91,000 German soldiers surrendered, laid down weapons, raised hands, emerged from positions, became prisoners, were taken into Soviet custody, the 91,000 who had survived thus far, who had endured pocket, who had survived months of suffering, who were alive to surrender, the 91,000 who were fraction, were remnant, were survivors of much larger force, the soldiers who surrendered, who were starving, who were emaciated, who were skeletons, who could barely walk, who could barely stand, who were barely alive. The prisoners who were frozen, who had severe frostbite, who had lost fingers, lost toes, lost feet, lost hands, who were damaged by cold, by winter, by temperature. The prisoners who were diseased, who had typhus, who had dysentery, who had infections, who were sick, who were dying from disease as much as from wounds or starvation. The prisoners who were wounded, who had injuries, who needed medical care, who weren't getting medical care, who were suffering, the 91,000 who surrendered, who were in terrible condition, who were already dying, who were barely surviving, who had endured months of horror, who had suffered beyond description, who now surrendered, who laid down weapons, who became prisoners, who began new phase of suffering, of dying that would kill most. Eventually, the physical appearance of prisoners shocked Soviet soldiers, shocked Soviet commanders, shocked everyone who saw them, the Germans who were skeletons, who were emaciated beyond description, who were barely recognizable as human, who weighed 40 kilograms, 30 kilograms, who were skin and bones, who had no fat, no muscle, who were consumed by starvation, by hunger, by months of insufficient food. The appearance that was shocking, that was horrifying, that showed clearly what had happened in pocket, what conditions had been, what suffering had occurred. The Germans who looked like concentration camp victims, who were barely alive, who were walking corpses, who were evidence of catastrophe, of months of horror, of conditions that were unimaginable, the appearance, the physical condition, the evidence. That shocked, that horrified, that showed what had happened, what Stalingrad had been, what pocket had done, to 300,000 men, to 6th Army, to everyone who had been trapped there. The surrender was end, was conclusion, was final act of battle. But surrender raised questions, created need for explanation, demanded understanding. How did it come to this? How did German 6th Army, that had been powerful, that had been effective, that had conquered so much, reach this moment, reach this surrender, reach this catastrophe? How did 300,000 men become 91,000 skeletons? How did army become collection of dying prisoners? How did force become remnant? The questions that surrender created. That moment demanded. That conclusion required answering. The surrender that was end. But that was also beginning. Beginning of understanding, beginning of explanation, beginning of story that must be told, that must be understood, that must be traced. From encirclement to surrender, from November to February, from 300,000 to 91,000, from army to prisoners, from soldiers to dying men, from functional military force to collection of suffering humans. The questions that must be answered, that demand explanation, that require understanding. The moment of surrender was quiet, was undramatic, was anticlimactic almost, was simply men laying down weapons, raising hands, walking into captivity, becoming prisoners. No final stand, no heroic resistance, no dramatic conclusion, just surrender, just end, just conclusion. The moment that was quiet, that was sad, that was simply over. But moment contained everything, contained months of suffering, contained deaths of hundreds of thousands, contained catastrophe that had been unfolding since November, contained horror that had accumulated, contained all the dying, all the freezing, all the starving, all the suffering that had occurred, that had been endured, that had killed so many, that had destroyed army, that had created this moment, this surrender, this end, the moment. That was quiet. That was simple. That was just over. But that contained everything. That was product of everything. That was result of months of catastrophe, of dying, of horror. That had preceded it. The surrender was not just military defeat, was not just tactical loss, was not just operational failure, was human catastrophe, was suffering on enormous scale, was death that numbered hundreds of thousands, was conditions that tested limits of endurance, was horror that shocked even hardened Soviet soldiers who had seen much, who had endured much, who were surprised by condition of German prisoners, who were shocked by appearance, who were horrified by evidence of what had occurred in pocket. The surrender, that was not just military event, was human catastrophe, was evidence of suffering, of dying, of conditions that killed, that destroyed, that reduced 300,000 to 91,000, that created skeletons from soldiers, that made dying men from army. The surrender, that was catastrophe, that was horror, that was evidence of everything that had happened, of everything that had been endured, of everything that had killed. The surrender. February 1st and 2nd, 1943, at Stalingrad. That ended battle. That concluded fighting. That created prisoners. That began new phase. Of suffering, of dying, that would continue, that would persist, that would kill most who surrendered. Eventually, the moment of surrender. That was end of battle, but not end of dying, not end of suffering, not end of catastrophe, just transition from one horror to another, from pocket to captivity, from German hands to Soviet hands, from one form of dying to another form of dying, the moment, the surrender, the end. That was also beginning, of next phase, of continued dying, of catastrophe that would persist, that would continue, that would kill most. Eventually, the moment of surrender, at Stalingrad, February 1st and 2nd, 1943. The end. That demands explanation. That requires understanding. That begins story. That must be told. 3 months earlier, November 19th, 1942. Dawn on the steppes. The landscape around Stalingrad was flat, was open, was typical Russian steppe, was grassland that extended to horizon, that was featureless almost, that offered little cover, little concealment, that was open terrain, that was defenders' nightmare, attackers' advantage. The steppe, where Romanian armies held positions, north of Stalingrad, south of Stalingrad, where they defended flanks of German position, where they protected approaches, where they were Germany's allies, where they were weak point, where vulnerability, where Soviet offensive would strike, where Operation Uranus would hit, where catastrophe would begin. The Romanian forces were inadequate for the task, were poorly equipped, had obsolete weapons, had inadequate anti-tank guns, had insufficient artillery, had old rifles, had limited ammunition, were not mechanized, had limited mobility, had poor communications, were not prepared for modern warfare, for Soviet offensive. For what was coming, the Romanian armies, that were assigned critical positions, that were protecting German flanks, that were holding key terrain, that were inadequate, that were undermanned, that were poorly supplied, that were not capable of stopping what was coming, that were weak point, that Soviet planners had identified, that Soviet intelligence had assessed, that Soviet command had targeted. The Romanians, who were allies, who were assigned important positions, who were inadequate for task, who would break, who would collapse, who would enable encirclement, who would make catastrophe possible. The Soviet offensive was carefully planned, was extensively prepared, was secretly organized. The Soviet forces that were assembled, that were concentrated, that were positioned, that were ready. The planning that had taken months, that had been detailed, that had been thorough. The Soviet commanders who had studied terrain, who had identified weak points, who had planned where to strike, how to strike, when to strike. The planning that was professional, that was careful, that was designed to encircle, to trap, to destroy. The Soviet forces that were assembled north of Stalingrad, that were assembled south, that were positioned, that were ready, that were waiting for November 19th, for dawn, for moment to strike. The planning, the preparation, the positioning, that was complete, that was ready, that was about to begin, about to strike, about to create catastrophe. The Soviet offensive began with artillery bombardment, began at dawn, with massive barrage, with overwhelming fire, with thousands of guns firing simultaneously. The bombardment that was devastating, that was stunning, that was overwhelming. The Romanian positions that were hit, that were shelled, that were bombarded, that were subjected to fire that was beyond anything experienced, that destroyed positions, that killed thousands, that shattered defenses, that made resistance nearly impossible, that prepared way for assault, the artillery bombardment, that lasted hours, that fired thousands of shells, that delivered tons of explosives, that destroyed Romanian positions, that killed defenders, that made breakthrough possible. That was first phase, that was preparation, that was what enabled everything that followed. The bombardment, that was massive, that was overwhelming, that was devastating, that was effective, that achieved objective, that prepared positions for assault, that made breakthrough possible, that enabled encirclement, that started catastrophe. The Soviet assault came after bombardment, the infantry that advanced, the tanks that advanced, the forces that pushed forward, that attacked Romanian positions, that broke through defenses, that exploited gaps, that pushed deep, that advanced rapidly, the Romanian defenses that collapsed, that broke, that couldn't hold, that couldn't resist, that were overwhelmed, that were destroyed, that were shattered by bombardment, that were incapable of stopping assault. The Romanian soldiers who retreated, who fled, who broke, who couldn't hold positions, who couldn't maintain line, who couldn't stop Soviets. The breakthrough, that occurred rapidly. That was complete. That was devastating. The Soviet forces that poured through gaps, that exploited breakthrough, that pushed deep into rear areas, that advanced toward objectives, that moved to encircle, to trap, to close ring. The northern and southern offensives advanced rapidly, advanced toward each other, were pincers designed to meet, to close ring, to encircle German forces, to trap Sixth Army. The northern attack from bridgeheads north of Stalingrad, the southern attack from positions south of city, the two prongs that advanced, that pushed forward, that moved toward each other, that were designed to meet, that would close trap, that would complete encirclement, that would create pocket, the advances that were rapid, that covered ground quickly, that moved through Romanian rear areas, that encountered limited resistance, that pushed toward meeting point, that approached each other, that came closer, that would meet, that would close ring, that would trap Sixth Army, the pincers, that advanced, that approached, that came closer, day by day, hour by hour, that would meet, that would close trap, that would create catastrophe. The German Sixth Army was in Stalingrad, was engaged in brutal urban combat, was fighting for the city, street by street, building by building, floor by floor, was committed to battle, was focused forward, was engaged completely in fighting, was trying to take city, to defeat Soviet defenders, to achieve victory that Hitler demanded, to complete conquest of Stalingrad, the army that was spread across ruins, that was distributed through destroyed city, that was committed to combat, that was engaged, that was focused on battle ahead. Not on flanks, not on rear, not on vulnerability, not on danger that was developing. The Sixth Army, that was fighting, that was engaged, that was winning slowly, that was advancing gradually, that was taking city building by building, that didn't see trap closing, that didn't realize danger, that didn't understand that encirclement was coming. That doom was approaching, that catastrophe was being created. The army, that was focused forward, that was engaged in battle, that was unaware, that would be trapped, that would be surrounded, that would be doomed. Paulus was informed of Soviet offensive, was told of attacks on Romanian positions, was receiving reports of breakthrough, of Romanian collapse, of Soviet advances, was understanding that situation was serious, was dangerous, was potentially catastrophic, was recognizing that encirclement was possible, was likely, was happening. Paulus, who understood immediately what this meant, what was happening, what was coming, the experienced commander, who saw clearly, who understood, who knew that army was in danger, that encirclement was possible, that trap was closing. Paulus, who immediately requested permission to withdraw, to retreat, to pull back from Stalingrad, to escape encirclement while possible, to break out before trap closed completely. The request, that was immediate, that was urgent, that was necessary, that was only option, that was what had to be done, to save army, to avoid catastrophe, to escape trap, the request for permission to withdraw. That went to higher command, that went to Hitler, that required approval from Supreme Commander, that waited for decision, that waited for permission, that was urgent, that was necessary, that was only way to save army. The Soviet pincers met at Kalak, small town west of Stalingrad, on Don River. The meeting occurred on November 23rd. 4 days after offensive began, the northern and southern Soviet forces that met. That closed ring, that completed encirclement, that trapped 6th Army, that trapped other German units, that trapped Romanian units that remained. That trapped Croatian units, that trapped approximately 300,000 men. The meeting at Kalak. That was decisive moment. That was when trap closed. That was when encirclement was complete. That was when escape became impossible. That was when fate was sealed. The meeting, that was simple. That was Soviet units encountering each other, recognizing each other, linking up, establishing continuous line, closing ring, completing encirclement, creating pocket. The meeting at Kalak, November 23rd. That closed trap, that created pocket, that sealed fate of 300,000 men, that began catastrophe, that started dying, that initiated horror, that would unfold over next months. The meeting, that was decisive, that was catastrophic, that was doom. The pocket that was created was substantial in size, was approximately 50 kilometers from east to west at widest point, was approximately 40 kilometers from north to south at deepest point, was area of roughly 2,000 square kilometers, was space that contained Stalingrad ruins, that contained steppe to west, that contained several villages, that contained some infrastructure, that contained airfields, that contained everything that was now surrounded. The pocket, that was large enough to contain 300,000 men, that had space for movement initially, that had area for deployment, that had room for positions, that seemed substantial, that seemed large, but that was too large to defend easily, that was too small to contain adequate supplies, that required long perimeter to defend, that consumed forces just holding line, that was trap, that was prison, that was killing ground, that was space where army would die. The dimensions, that seemed substantial, that seemed large, but that were inadequate. That created problems. That made defense difficult. That made supply impossible. That made survival unlikely. Hitler's decision came quickly, was to hold, was to stand fast, was to maintain position, was to not withdraw, was to not retreat, was to not break out. The order that came from Supreme Command, that came from Hitler personally, that was explicit, that was clear, that was unambiguous. Hold Stalingrad, defend positions, wait for relief. Do not retreat, do not withdraw, do not break out, The order. That was based on Göring's promise that airlift could supply army, that 500 tons daily could be delivered, that army could be sustained until relief arrived. The order. That was based on belief that holding was possible, that supply by air was feasible, that relief would come, that army could survive, could hold, could wait. The order. That sealed fate, that made escape impossible, that condemned army, that created catastrophe, that killed 300,000 men. Eventually, the order. From Hitler. To hold, to not retreat, to wait, to stay. The order. That was fatal, that was doom, that was death sentence, that condemned army, that created catastrophe. Paulus obeyed the order, was German officer, was trained to obey, was bound by duty, was following chain of command, was doing what he was trained to do, what he was expected to do, what duty required, obeyed Hitler's order, cancelled plans for breakout, ordered army to establish defensive positions, to hold pocket, to defend perimeter, to wait for relief, to prepare for sustained defense. The obedience. That was training, that was duty, that was German military culture, that was what was expected, what was required, what officers did. The obedience. That was also death sentence, was doom, was catastrophe. The order that should have been disobeyed, that should have been questioned, that should have been ignored, but that wasn't, that was followed, that was obeyed, that condemned army, that sealed fate, that made catastrophe inevitable. Paulus, who obeyed, who followed orders, who did duty, who commanded army to hold, to stay, to defend, to wait, who condemned 300,000 men by obeying, by following orders, by doing what he was trained to do. The obedience, that was military virtue, that was also death sentence, that killed, that destroyed, that created catastrophe. The encirclement was complete. The trap was closed. The pocket was sealed. 300,000 men were surrounded, were cut off from supplies, from reinforcement, from escape, were isolated, were trapped, were doomed. The encirclement, that was complete, that was catastrophic, that was beginning of end. November 23, 1942, when pocket was sealed, when trap closed, when fate was determined, when dying began, when catastrophe started, when horror was initiated. The encirclement, that would lead to months of suffering, to deaths of hundreds of thousands, to destruction of army, to catastrophe that would shock world. The trap, that closed, that sealed, that condemned. 300,000 men at Stalingrad in November. The trap, the encirclement, the beginning of catastrophe, of dying, of end. Hermann Göring was Reichsmarschall, was commander of Luftwaffe, was second most powerful man in Nazi Germany after Hitler, was responsible for German air forces, for air operations, for everything involving Luftwaffe, was overweight, was addicted to drugs, was increasingly divorced from reality, was prone to making promises he couldn't keep, to assuring Hitler of things that weren't possible, to guaranteeing results that couldn't be achieved, was man whose promises would condemn 300,000 men, whose assurances would seal fate of 6th Army, whose guarantee would create catastrophe. Göring, who promised, who assured, who guaranteed, who lied, who condemned, who killed. Through promise, through false assurance, through impossible guarantee. The promise came immediately after encirclement, when Hitler was deciding whether to order 6th Army to break out or to hold position, when decision was being made, when fate was being determined. Göring promised Hitler, promised that Luftwaffe could supply 6th Army by air, could deliver supplies to trapped forces, could sustain army until relief arrived, could deliver 500 tons per day, every day, consistently, reliably. The promise that 500 tons daily could be delivered, that airlift was feasible, that supply by air was possible, That army could be sustained, could be kept combat capable, could be supplied until relieved. The promise. That seemed to make holding possible. That seemed to justify not breaking out. That seemed to enable army to survive while surrounded. That seemed to solve problem. That seemed to make Hitler's preferred option viable. The promise from Göring, from Reichsmarschall, from commander of Luftwaffe, from man responsible for air forces. The promise that Hitler believed, that Hitler relied upon, that determined Hitler's decision. That led to order to hold position, that prevented breakout, that condemned army. The promise was impossible from the start, was based on fantasy, was divorced from reality, was lie. The Luftwaffe did not have capacity to deliver 500 tons daily, did not have sufficient transport aircraft, did not have sufficient fuel, did not have sufficient air crews, did not have sufficient ground support, did not have sufficient anything. The transport fleet was scattered, was assigned to various duties, was not concentrated, was not available for single massive airlift operation. The aircraft that existed were Junkers Ju-52 primarily, were 3-engine transport planes, could carry approximately 2 to 3 tons each, would require over 150 aircraft flying successful missions daily, flying into pocket, landing, unloading, taking off, returning, repeating, every day. The requirement. That was impossible. That couldn't be met. That Göring promised anyway. The Luftwaffe had perhaps 300 Ju-52 aircraft available in entire theater. Not all were operational. Not all were available for airlift. Not all could be concentrated for Stalingrad. The aircraft that could be assembled numbered perhaps 150, perhaps 200 at most, would require every single aircraft to fly successful mission daily, to fly into pocket, to land safely, to unload, to take off safely, to return, to repeat next day, every single day, without losses, without mechanical failures, without weather preventing flights, without enemy interference. The requirement. That was impossible. That couldn't be achieved. That anyone with knowledge of aviation would know was impossible. That Göring promised anyway. That Göring assured Hitler was possible. That Göring guaranteed would happen. The conditions for airlift were terrible from the beginning. The winter weather in southern Russia was severe, was getting worse, was approaching worst of winter. The storms were frequent. The snow was heavy. The ice was constant. The visibility was poor. The conditions that grounded aircraft, that prevented takeoffs, that made landings impossible, that made flying dangerous, that made airlift nearly impossible. The weather. That was enemy to aviation. That was barrier to flight. That was obstacle that couldn't be overcome. The weather. That reduced number of flying days, that limited number of missions, that prevented achievement of 500 tons daily, that made promise impossible even with sufficient aircraft, even with perfect organization, even with everything else working. The weather. That was first reason promise was impossible. First obstacle, first barrier. That couldn't be overcome. The airfields in pocket were limited, were inadequate, were primitive, were poorly equipped, were becoming worse. The main airfield was Pitomnik, was grass airfield, was becoming muddy, was becoming icy, was developing holes, was being damaged by use, was becoming less usable. The secondary airfield was Gumrak, was smaller, was less capable, was backup, was inadequate even as backup. The airfields. That were only way supplies could arrive. That were limited. That were becoming worse, that were being damaged, that were inadequate for required traffic, for required operations, for achievement of 500 tons daily. The airfields. That were second reason promise was impossible. Second obstacle. Second barrier. The Soviet defenses increased rapidly. The anti-aircraft guns were positioned around pocket, were concentrated near approach routes, were waiting for German transports. The Soviet fighters were assigned to intercept transports, were hunting German aircraft, were shooting them down. The defenses. that made flights dangerous, that caused losses, that were deadly, the German transports that were slow, that were vulnerable, that were easy targets, that were being shot down, that were being destroyed. The losses? That began immediately, that were unsustainable, that depleted transport fleet, that reduced available aircraft, that made impossible tasks even more impossible. The Soviet defenses. That were third reason promise was impossible. Third obstacle, third barrier. That killed, that destroyed, that made airlift catastrophic failure. The actual airlift began immediately after encirclement. The transport aircraft that were assembled, that were concentrated, that began flying missions, that attempted to deliver supplies, the flights, that took off from airfields outside Pocket, that flew to Potomnik or Gumrak, that attempted to land, that unloaded supplies if successful, that took off again if possible, that returned to base, that repeated, day after day. The airlift, that was attempted, that was maintained, that operated under impossible conditions, that achieved fraction of what was promised, that delivered fraction of what was needed, that failed. Catastrophically. The actual delivery averaged approximately 100 tons per day. Some days achieved 150 tons. Many days achieved less, 70 tons, 50 tons. Some days achieved nothing when weather prevented all flights. The average. That was approximately 100 tons. That was 1/5 of what was promised. That was 1/5 of what was needed. The 6th Army required minimum 500 tons daily to maintain combat capability, to feed troops, to provide ammunition, to deliver medical supplies, to provide fuel, to provide everything needed, to function as army. The 500 tons. That were minimum, that were necessary, that were required, that were promised, that were not delivered, that were not even close to being delivered. The deficit, that was immediate, that was 400 tons daily, that accumulated, that compounded, that grew, that killed. The mathematics were simple, were brutal, were fatal. 500 tons needed daily, 100 tons delivered daily, 400-ton deficit daily. The deficit over 1 week was 2,800 tons. Over 1 month was 12,000 tons. Over 3 months was 36,000 tons. The accumulated deficit, that was enormous, that was catastrophic, that was impossible to overcome. The supplies that were needed but not delivered, that should have been there but weren't, that would have sustained army but didn't arrive. The mathematics, that was simple, that anyone could calculate, that showed clearly. This was not sustainable, this was not survivable, this was death. The arithmetic of catastrophe, the mathematics of doom, the numbers that couldn't lie, that showed clearly, that proved definitively. The airlift failed. The promise was false. The army was doomed. The supplies that did arrive by airlift were desperately needed, were consumed immediately, were distributed quickly, were insufficient. The ammunition that arrived was used in combat, was exhausted quickly, was never enough. The food that arrived was distributed to troops, was eaten immediately, was never sufficient, was always leaving men hungry. The medical supplies that arrived were consumed treating wounded, were never adequate, were always insufficient, were leaving many untreated. The fuel that arrived was used for vehicles, for generators, for heating, was never enough. The supplies that arrived by airlift, that were fraction of need, that were consumed immediately, that were insufficient, that were proof of failure, that demonstrated impossibility, that showed that promise was lie. The aircraft losses were heavy, were unsustainable. The transports that were shot down by Soviet fighters, that were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, that crashed due to weather, that were lost to mechanical failure, that were destroyed on ground by Soviet artillery, that were lost. The losses, that numbered hundreds of aircraft, that killed hundreds of aircrew, that depleted transport fleet, that reduced capacity further, that made already impossible task even more impossible. The losses that were product of Soviet defenses, of weather, of strain of continuous operations, of inadequate maintenance, of everything, the losses that were unsustainable, that consumed transport fleet, that reduced Luftwaffe capability, that made airlift progressively worse, that made delivery progressively less, that made failure progressively more complete. Göring's promise was foundation of Hitler's decision, was basis for order to hold, was justification for not allowing breakout. The promise that made Hitler believe holding was possible, that made him think army could be sustained, that made him order Sixth Army to stay in place, to wait for relief, to defend pocket. The promise that was lie, that was impossible, that was based on nothing, that condemned 300,000 men, that sealed their fate, that created catastrophe. The promise, that was words, that was assurance, that was guarantee, that was nothing, that was lie, that killed, through simple arithmetic, through mathematics that couldn't be overcome, through deficit that accumulated daily, through supplies that didn't arrive, through food that wasn't delivered, through ammunition that wasn't provided, through everything that was promised but not delivered. The promise, that killed, that condemned, that destroyed. The responsibility for catastrophe rests partly with Göring, who promised what couldn't be delivered, who assured what couldn't be achieved, who guaranteed what was impossible, who knew or should have known that this was impossible, that Luftwaffe couldn't do this, that 500 tons daily couldn't be delivered, who promised anyway, who condemned 300,000 men, who created catastrophe, through promise, through false assurance, through lie. The responsibility, that is clear, that is documented, that is historical fact. Göring promised. Promise was false. Promise condemned army. Promise killed 300,000 men. Eventually. Through starvation, through cold, through suffering, through slow death. That was product of insufficient supplies. That was result of failed airlift. That was consequence of false promise. Göring's promise, that condemned them, that killed them, that destroyed Sixth Army, through simple arithmetic, through mathematics of catastrophe, through promise that was lie. The promise that condemned 300,000 men. The winter of 1942 to 1943 was severe, was one of coldest winters on record in southern Russia, was winter that arrived early, that was harsh from beginning, that grew progressively worse. The temperatures dropped rapidly after encirclement. The late November cold that was already below freezing, already uncomfortable, already dangerous. The December cold that was severe, that dropped to -20 Celsius, -25. That was harsh. That was dangerous. That was killing. The January cold that was extreme, that reached -30 Celsius regularly. That reached -40 on worst days. That was beyond what most humans experience. That was extreme cold. That was deadly cold. That was killing cold. The temperatures that were measured, that were recorded, that were numbers, but that were also experience, were suffering, were death. The cold that was -30, -40, that was extreme, that was deadly, that was catastrophic. The German soldiers were not prepared for Russian winter, was failure of planning, was product of Hitler's belief that war would be over quickly, that winter preparations weren't necessary. The belief that was false, that left soldiers unprepared, unequipped, vulnerable. The winter clothing that was inadequate, was insufficient for extreme cold. The uniforms designed for milder climate, that were standard German military uniforms, that had some cold weather features, but that were not designed for -40 degrees, were not insulated enough, were not warm enough, were not protective enough against Russian winter. The uniforms that were inadequate, that left soldiers cold, that left them exposed, that left them vulnerable. The boots were critical failure, were standard German military boots, were leather, were good quality, but were not winter boots, were not insulated, were not designed for extreme cold, did not protect feet adequately, did not prevent frostbite, were inadequate for Russian winter. The boots that left feet exposed to cold, that led to frostbite, that led to amputations, that led to disability. The boots that were one of most critical equipment failures, that caused enormous casualties, that disabled tens of thousands through frostbite. The shelter was inadequate. The pocket was mostly open steppe, was few buildings, was ruins of Stalingrad, was destroyed structures, was damaged buildings, was no intact shelter. The soldiers who dug into frozen ground, who created dugouts, who attempted to create shelter. The dugouts that were shallow, that were inadequate, that didn't protect against cold. The buildings that were available were ruins, were damaged, had no roofs often, had holes in walls, provided minimal shelter, some protection from wind, but not from cold, not from temperature. The shelter that was inadequate, that left soldiers exposed, that made cold worse, that made freezing inevitable. The frostbite began within days of extreme cold arriving, began in late November, became epidemic in December, became universal almost in January. The frostbite that was product of cold, of inadequate protection, of exposure, of insufficient clothing, of inadequate boots. The frostbite that began with fingers, toes, extremities. That was most common. That affected everyone almost. The symptoms that began with numbness, tingling, pain. That progressed to freezing of tissue, to damage of tissue, to death of tissue. The frostbite that was progressive. That worsened. That went from mild to severe, from uncomfortable to disabling, from treatable to requiring amputation. The early stages of frostbite were painful, uncomfortable, limiting. The fingers that were numb, that couldn't grip properly, that couldn't hold weapons effectively. The toes that were numb, that made walking painful, that made marching difficult. The early frostbite that affected everyone, that reduced capability, that made everything harder, that made combat harder, made functions harder, made survival harder. The pain, numbness, limitation that came from early frostbite, that affected tens of thousands, that reduced effectiveness, that degraded combat capability. The severe frostbite was catastrophic, was disabling, was requiring amputation. The tissue that froze completely, that died, that became necrotic, that turned black, that became gangrenous, that required amputation to prevent spread, to save life. The fingers that turned black, that were amputated. The toes that froze, that were removed. The feet that were frozen, that were amputated. The hands that were destroyed. The extremities that were killed by cold, that were removed by surgeons to save lives, to prevent gangrene. The amputations that numbered thousands, that were performed constantly, that filled field hospitals. The field hospitals became amputation factories, were performing amputations constantly, were sawing off frozen extremities, were removing dead tissue, were trying to save lives. The surgeons who performed amputations endlessly, who removed frozen limbs, who worked constantly, who were overwhelmed, who couldn't keep up. The surgeries performed without adequate anesthesia, often, with minimal pain relief. The wounded who screamed during surgery, who felt amputation, who endured agony. The field hospitals that were overwhelmed, that were places of suffering, that were evidence of catastrophe. The frostbite casualties numbered tens of thousands, were more than combat casualties initially, were product of cold, of inadequate preparation, of extreme exposure. The soldiers disabled by frostbite, who lost fingers and couldn't hold weapons, who lost feet and couldn't walk. who became casualties not of combat, but of weather. The casualties that reduced combat effectiveness, that diminished army, that weakened force, the tens of thousands disabled by frostbite, who were casualties of cold, who showed that temperature was weapon. The deaths from cold were numerous, were documented, were product of extreme exposure, of hypothermia, of freezing. The soldiers who froze to death, who died from cold, who were found frozen. The bodies that were stiff, that were ice, that were frozen solid. The soldiers who died from exposure, who couldn't maintain body temperature, who succumbed to cold. The deaths that numbered thousands, that were caused not by combat, but by weather. The deaths from cold that numbered thousands, that showed that temperature was killer. The psychological effects of cold were profound, were devastating. The constant cold that was never relieved, that was always present. The soldiers who were never warm, who were always cold, who were always suffering, who endured pain constantly from cold. The cold that made everything harder, that made fighting difficult, that made survival difficult. The cold that was constant presence, that was unending suffering, that broke morale, that destroyed spirits, that made men give up, that made death seem preferable. The psychological toll of constant cold. The cold that was physical enemy, that was also psychological weapon, that destroyed bodies and minds, that killed thousands, that disabled tens of thousands, that affected everyone. That was first wave of destruction, first catastrophe, first killer of trapped army at Stalingrad. The cold, the winter, the temperature, the first enemy. The hunger began immediately. Not immediately after encirclement, perhaps, but within days, within week, when stockpiled supplies were consumed, when normal rations couldn't be maintained, when shortage became apparent, when reality became clear, that supplies were insufficient, that airlift was inadequate, that food was limited, that hunger was coming, that starvation was inevitable, the hunger that began quickly, that would worsen progressively, that would kill more than cold, that would destroy more than temperature, that would be deadliest enemy, deadliest killer, deadliest catastrophe. The supplies in the pocket were limited from start, were what was present when trap closed, were stockpiles that existed, were reserves that had been accumulated, were supplies for normal operations, not for siege, not for months of isolation, not for 300,000 men cut off from resupply. The supplies meant for days, for weeks perhaps, not for months, not for winter, not for siege conditions. The supplies that were inadequate from start, that were insufficient for situation, that were consumed rapidly, that were exhausted quickly, that left army dependent on airlift, on supplies that arrived by air, on delivery that was inadequate, on promise that was false. The rations were reduced within days, were cut from normal levels, were decreased to conserve supplies, to make food last longer, to delay inevitable. The reduction that was necessary, that was inevitable. That was only option. But that meant soldiers were hungry, were receiving less food, were not getting adequate nutrition. The rations reduced from normal to 750 calories, then to 500, then to 300, then to less. The progressive reduction, the systematic decrease, the diminishing food, that was policy. That was necessity, but that meant starvation, meant weakening, meant dying eventually. The normal German soldier required approximately 3,000 calories per day for combat operations, for physical activity, for functioning in cold, for maintaining body temperature. The 3,000 calories that were requirement, that were necessary, that were what soldiers needed to function. The rations in pocket that dropped to 750 calories, then 500, then 300. The deficit that was enormous, that was 2,000 calories or more daily. The body that required 3,000, that received 300, had deficit of 2,700. the body forced to consume itself, to burn fat, to burn muscle, to destroy itself, to die slowly. The horses were critical food source, were 50,000 horses in pocket approximately, were transport horses, artillery horses, cavalry horses, were military assets, were mobility, were capability, were also protein, were meat, were food, were resource that would be consumed. The decision to slaughter horses was made quickly, was necessary, was inevitable, was only way to supplement inadequate rations, to provide protein, to delay starvation. The horses systematically slaughtered, were killed methodically, were butchered, were consumed, were eaten by starving soldiers, were supplement to rations. The horse meat that was tough, that was barely palatable, that was eaten anyway, that was consumed desperately, that sustained, that provided calories, that provided protein, that delayed starvation temporarily. The horses were consumed rapidly, were slaughtered at rate of hundreds per day, were eaten, were gone. The 50,000 horses that seemed like substantial resource were consumed in weeks, were exhausted by December, were gone, were all eaten. Left nothing, left soldiers with only inadequate rations from airlift, with starvation, level supplies. The horses that sustained temporarily, that provided critical protein, that delayed catastrophe, were gone, were consumed, left army with nothing, left soldiers starving, the horses that were eaten, consumed, exhausted. That left hunger, that left starvation. The physical effects of starvation were progressive, systematic, documented, visible. The weight loss that began immediately, that was rapid, that was severe. The soldiers who lost weight quickly, who became thin, who became gaunt, who became skeletal. The weight loss that was documented, that showed soldiers losing 20 kilograms, 30 kilograms, 40 kilograms. The men who weighed 70 kilograms who dropped to 50, to 40, to 30. The weight loss that was rapid, severe, catastrophic. That was visible evidence of starvation, of body consuming itself. The starvation changed appearance dramatically. The soldiers who became unrecognizable, who looked like concentration camp victims, who were skin and bones, who had no fat, no muscle, who were just skeleton covered by skin. The faces that were gaunt, hollow, that showed bones. The eyes that were sunken, deep in sockets. The bodies that were skeletal, that showed ribs, spine, every bone. The appearance that was shocking, horrifying. That showed starvation clearly. That was evidence of catastrophe. The appearance that shocked Soviet soldiers later. That was evidence, documentation, proof of starvation. The weakness from starvation was debilitating, progressive, total eventually. The soldiers who were weak, who couldn't perform duties, who couldn't function. The weakness that came from lack of calories, from body consuming itself, from muscle being burned for energy. The weakness that made combat difficult, made fighting hard, made resistance challenging. The soldiers who couldn't march long distances, who couldn't carry equipment, who couldn't dig fortifications, who were too weak. The weakness that reduced combat effectiveness, that diminished capability, that degraded performance, that made army less dangerous, less capable, less effective. The psychological effects of hunger were profound, devastating, all-consuming. The hunger that was constant, overwhelming. The soldiers who were obsessed with food, who talked about food constantly, who thought about food continuously, who dreamed about food, who remembered meals, who described favorite dishes, who were consumed by hunger, by obsession with eating, the psychological obsession that was product of starvation. That was effect of extreme hunger, the obsession that dominated consciousness. That was all there was. The deaths from starvation were numerous, were more than deaths from cold, were more than deaths from combat, were majority of deaths in pocket, the soldiers who starved to death, who died from malnutrition, who died from body consuming itself completely, who died from organs shutting down, from systems failing, the death from starvation that was slow, agonizing, terrible, the progression from hunger to weakness to emaciation to organ failure to death, the progression that took weeks, months sometimes. That was slow dying, that was watching oneself die, the deaths that numbered tens of thousands, that were majority, that were most deaths in pocket, that were product of hunger, of insufficient food, of failed airlift, of broken promise. The starvation reduced army systematically, reduced combat effectiveness, reduced capability, reduced function. The army that was weak, that was emaciated, that was starving, could not fight effectively, could not defend strongly, could not resist vigorously, was degraded, was diminished, was destroyed by hunger. The starvation that was strategic catastrophe, that was military disaster. That was what destroyed Sixth Army as much as anything, as much as Soviet forces, as much as cold. The starvation, the hunger, the second enemy. That was deadlier than first. That killed more. That destroyed more. That was catastrophe. That killed tens of thousands. That destroyed army. That was product of failed airlift, of broken promise, of insufficient supplies. The hunger, the starvation, the second enemy, the deadliest killer. December 12th, 1942. 3 weeks after encirclement. The German military command outside Pocket had not been idle, had been planning relief operation, had been assembling forces, had been organizing attempt to rescue Sixth Army, to break through to trapped forces, to open corridor, to enable resupply, perhaps to enable evacuation. The relief operation, that was Germany's response to encirclement, was attempt to save 300,000 men, to rescue trapped army, to reverse catastrophe. The operation, that was given name, Operation Winter Storm, Unternehmen Wintergewitter. The Winter Storm, that would attempt to break through, that would try to reach Pocket, that would attempt to save Sixth Army. The relief force was commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, was one of Germany's best commanders, was experienced, was capable, was respected, was given impossible task, to break through Soviet lines, to reach Stalingrad, to save Sixth Army with inadequate forces, with insufficient resources, with limited time. The task. That was nearly impossible, but that had to be attempted. That was Germany's only chance. That was last hope. For Sixth Army, for 300,000 men, for trapped army, Manstein, who commanded, who organized, who planned, who would attempt impossible, who would try to save army, who would come close, but who would fail, ultimately. The forces assembled for Winter Storm were inadequate, were what could be gathered, were what was available, were not sufficient for task. The force. That included 4th Panzer Army, that included several panzer divisions, that included infantry divisions, that included supporting units, the force. That seemed substantial, that seemed capable, but that was not enough. Was too small to break through strong Soviet defenses, was too weak to reach Stalingrad, was insufficient for task, but was what existed, was what could be assembled, was what would have to do. The force. That was inadequate, but that was all there was. That would have to attempt, that would try to reach Pocket, that would try to save army. The relief force. That was assembled, that was organized, that was ready, that was insufficient, but that would try anyway. The operation began on December 12th. The relief force attacked. Attacked from southwest of Stalingrad. Attacked toward Pocket, toward trapped army, toward 300,000 men. The attack. That made progress initially. That broke through initial Soviet defenses. That advanced steadily. That moved toward Stalingrad. The advance. That was successful at first. That broke through Soviet lines. That pushed forward. That made progress. That covered ground. that came closer, that reduced distance to pocket, that raised hopes, that made rescue seem possible, that made salvation seem achievable. The advance. That was real, that was progress, that was hope. For first time since encirclement, for first time in weeks, there was hope. That relief would reach, that rescue would come, that salvation was possible. The relief force pushed forward steadily, advanced day by day, broke through Soviet defenses, defeated Soviet counterattacks, maintained momentum, kept advancing. The progress, that was documented. That was real, that was measurable. The distance, from relief force to pocket, that decreased, that diminished, that became smaller. From 200 kilometers to 150 to 100 to 75 to 50, the 50 kilometers. That remained. Between relief force and pocket, between rescuers and trapped, between salvation and doomed, the 50 kilometers. That was distance on December 19th, 1 week after operation began. The 50 kilometers. That was close. That was very close. That seemed achievable. That seemed crossable. That raised hopes to highest level. That made soldiers in pocket believe. That made them hope. That made them think. They would be saved. They would be rescued. They would survive. Inside pocket, anticipation grew. The soldiers heard about relief operation, heard about advance, heard about progress, heard that relief was close, was coming, was approaching. The hope. That had been dead. That had been gone. That had been extinguished. Came back, returned, grew. The soldiers, who had been hopeless, who had been despairing, who had been waiting to die, began hoping, began believing, began thinking. They might survive. They might be rescued. They might be saved. The anticipation, that grew, that built, that became powerful, that became overwhelming, that made suffering more bearable, that made hunger less terrible, that made cold less deadly. Because rescue was coming, because relief was near, because salvation was 50 kilometers away, the anticipation, the hope, the belief, that grew in pocket, that spread through army, that affected everyone, that made them believe, for first time in weeks, that they might survive, might be saved, might escape this trap. But Paulus was ordered to hold position, was specifically ordered not to break out, not to attempt to reach relief force. Hitler insisted that 6th Army remain in pocket, maintain positions, defend perimeter, wait for relief to arrive, not attempt to link up, not try to advance toward relief force, not try to break out. The order, that was critical, that was fatal, that prevented possible success. The 50 kilometers, that separated relief force and pocket, could have been reduced if both advanced toward each other. If Paulus broke out, if 6th Army moved southwest, toward relief force, while relief force moved northeast, toward pocket, the 50 kilometers, that could have become 25, could have become 10, could have become 0. If both moved, if both advanced, if breakout had been ordered, the 50 kilometers, that could have been crossed from both sides, that could have been eliminated, that could have enabled link-up, that could have enabled rescue, that could have saved army. But the order, to hold position, to not break out, to wait, prevented this, made it impossible, made rescue impossible. The Soviet command understood the danger, understood that relief force threatened to break through, threatened to reach pocket, threatened to rescue 6th Army, understood that this had to be stopped, had to be prevented, had to be defeated. The Soviet forces, that were reinforced, that were concentrated, that were positioned, to stop relief force, to prevent breakthrough, to defeat winter storm, the reinforcements, that were rushed to area, that were positioned against relief force, that attacked, that counterattacked, that fought, to stop advance, to prevent breakthrough, to defeat rescue attempt, the Soviet forces, that were substantial, that were determined, that were fighting to prevent relief, to stop rescue, to maintain encirclement, to ensure destruction of Sixth Army. The relief force was stopped, was defeated, was forced to halt at 50 kilometers from Pocket, could advance no further, was stopped by Soviet defenses, was defeated by Soviet counterattacks, was forced to defensive positions, could not reach Pocket, could not rescue army, could not achieve objective. The stopping of relief force. That occurred in late December. That ended hopes. That killed belief. That destroyed faith. That showed clearly. Rescue wasn't coming. Relief wouldn't arrive. Salvation was impossible. The relief force. That came so close. That came within 50 kilometers. That raised hopes so high. That made rescue seem possible. Was stopped. Was defeated. Was forced to retreat eventually. Was withdrawn. Left Sixth Army still trapped. Still surrounded. Still doomed. The failed relief. The stopped rescue. The defeated attempt. That ended hope. That killed belief. That was catastrophe. The moment hope died was identifiable. Was specific. Was when soldiers in Pocket learned. That relief force had been stopped. That advance had halted. That rescue wouldn't come. The moment. When hope died. When belief ended. When acceptance began. When soldiers understood they would not be rescued, would not be saved, would die here, in this pocket, in this winter, in this trap. The moment. That was transition, from hoping to despairing, from believing to accepting, from fighting for survival to fighting for end, from resistance to endurance, from trying to survive to accepting death. The moment hope died. That was psychological catastrophe. That was more devastating perhaps than physical suffering. That was worse perhaps than cold or hunger. That destroyed spirits. That broke morale. That killed will to fight. That killed will to survive. That made death seem inevitable. Made suffering seem purposeless. Made resistance seem futile. The moment hope died. That was terrible. That was final. That was when many gave up. When many stopped fighting. When many accepted death. When many just waited. For end. That was inevitable now. That was certain now. That was coming. The moment hope died. At Stalingrad. In Pocket. Late December. When winter storm failed. When relief stopped. When rescue became impossible. When hope died. The failed relief operation had consequences. Had effects beyond immediate military failure. The soldiers in Pocket, who had hoped, who had believed, who had thought rescue was coming, were devastated by failure, were destroyed by disappointment, were broken by end of hope. The failure. That made everything worse. That made suffering harder to bear. That made cold more unbearable. That made hunger more terrible. That made dying more certain. The failure. That killed hope. That destroyed morale. That broke spirits. That made resistance more difficult. That made endurance more challenging. That made death more certain. The psychological impact of failed relief, of stopped rescue, of ended hope, was catastrophic, was devastating, was perhaps more destructive than physical effects, than cold or hunger. The hope that died, that was killed, that was destroyed, by failed relief, by stopped rescue, by impossible 50 kilometers. The relief force retreated eventually, was withdrawn, was pulled back, was needed elsewhere, was moved to other sectors, left Sixth Army abandoned, left Pocket isolated, left 300,000 men to their fate, to death, to starvation, to freezing, to suffering, to eventual surrender or death. The retreat of relief force. That was final abandonment, was end of rescue attempts, was acceptance by German command. That Sixth Army could not be saved, that Pocket could not be relieved, that 300,000 men would die, or surrender, or both. The retreat. That was final, that was abandonment. That was death sentence. For 6th Army, for trapped men, for everyone in pocket. The distance of 50 kilometers became symbol, became measure of how close salvation came, how near rescue was, how possible survival seemed. The 50 kilometers, that was distance between life and death, between rescue and doom, between salvation and catastrophe. The 50 kilometers. That could have been crossed. That should have been crossed. That would have been crossed if breakout had been ordered, if both forces had advanced toward each other, if Hitler had permitted, if Paulus had been allowed. The 50 kilometers. That remained. That couldn't be crossed. That separated rescue from doomed. That stood between survival and death. The 50 kilometers. That became symbol of how close, how near, how possible rescue was, before it failed, before it stopped, before hope died. The soldiers in pocket never forgot, never forgave. The relief that came so close, that came within 50 kilometers, that raised hopes, that promised salvation, that ultimately failed, that was stopped, that retreated, that left them abandoned. The soldiers who had hoped, who had believed, who had waited, who had suffered more patiently, because rescue was coming, who were devastated when it failed, who were destroyed when hope died, who never forgot how close rescue came, how near salvation was, how possible survival seemed. Before it all ended, before hope died, before they were abandoned, to death, to starvation, to freezing, to suffering, to end, the failed relief. That came close, that raised hopes, that killed hope, that was catastrophic, that was devastating, that showed that 50 kilometers might as well have been 50,000. That close wasn't close enough, that near wasn't near enough, that hope wasn't enough, that rescue failed, that relief stopped, that 6th Army was doomed, the failed relief. Operation Winter Storm, that came within 50 kilometers, that stopped, that retreated, that failed, that killed hope. That was catastrophe. That was end of hope. That was moment when soldiers understood. They would die here, in this pocket, in this winter, in this trap, the failed relief, the stopped rescue, the death of hope. That occurred. In December, at Stalingrad, when Winter Storm failed, when hope died, when end became certain, the radio equipment in pocket was critical lifeline, was connection to outside world, was way 6th Army communicated with higher command, with German military command, with outside. The radio, that transmitted from pocket, that sent messages out, that received messages in, that maintained communication, that preserved connection, that kept Army from being completely isolated, completely alone, completely cut off. The radio, that was presence, that was voice, that was proof of existence. The radio, that would document everything, that would record decline, that would preserve voice of dying army, that would show, through messages, through communications, through words, how army declined, how situation worsened, how end approached. The radio, that was documentary, that was record, that was evidence, that would preserve, that would show, that would document. Everything. The early messages after encirclement were professional, were military communications, were proper reports, were standard military format. The messages, that reported situation, that described encirclement, that requested supplies, that asked for relief, that maintained military protocol, that followed proper procedures, that used correct format, that were professional, that were controlled, that were what military communication should be. The early messages, from late November, from early December, that reported encirclement, that described pocket, that listed needs, that requested help, that maintained discipline, that maintained form, that were professional military communications, from professional military organization, from functioning army, that still maintained structure, still maintained discipline, still maintained professionalism, despite circumstances, despite encirclement, despite catastrophe. The early messages that were professional, that were controlled, that maintained form. The messages provided tactical information, provided situation reports, described positions, reported casualties, requested supplies, listed needs. The standard military information that was transmitted, that was communicated, that kept higher command informed. The messages that described defensive positions, that reported Soviet attacks, that listed ammunition expenditure, that noted food consumption, that described conditions, that provided information, that enabled command to understand, to assess, to make decisions. The tactical information that was in messages, that was standard, that was expected, that was military procedure. The messages that were information, that were reports, that were communication, that maintained connection, that kept outside informed, that preserved link between trapped army and command, between pocket and outside, between isolated and connected. The messages that provided information, that reported situation, that communicated professionally, properly, as military should. The requests in early messages were standard military requests. Requests for supplies, for ammunition, for food, for fuel, for medical supplies, for everything needed. The requests that were proper, that were justified, that were reasonable, that were standard military procedure. Request needed supplies, list quantities, explain purposes, standard procedure. The requests that were professional, that were controlled, that were proper military communications. The early requests that asked for supplies, that listed needs, that explained requirements, that were professional requests from professional military organization, that maintained protocol, that maintained discipline, that maintained proper procedure, despite circumstances, despite situation, despite catastrophe developing. The early requests that were professional, that were proper, that maintained form. The messages changed gradually over time. The change was not sudden, was progressive, was gradual, was documented in preserved communications. The messages that remained professional, that maintained form, but that showed increasing strain, showed increasing desperation, showed increasing urgency. The military professionalism that began showing cracks, that began showing stress, that began showing reality beneath. The controlled tone that began breaking, the proper format that began bending, the professional communications that began showing desperation. The change that was gradual, that was progressive, that was documented, that showed decline, that revealed deterioration, that documented catastrophe through words, through messages, through communications. That changed over time, from November to December to January, from professional to strained to desperate, from controlled to breaking, from military to human. The change that was documented, that was preserved, that shows how army declined, how situation worsened, how end approached. The December messages showed the strain clearly, showed the stress, showed the desperation growing. The messages that reported increasingly desperate situation, that described inadequate airlift, that listed mounting casualties, that described worsening conditions, that noted declining rations, that reported increasing cold casualties, that painted picture of deteriorating situation, of dying army, of catastrophe unfolding. The December messages that still maintained some professional form, that still used military protocol somewhat, but that showed strain, that revealed desperation, that communicated urgency, that showed situation was critical, was worsening, was becoming catastrophic. The December messages that documented decline, that recorded deterioration, that showed, through words, through communications, how army was suffering, how conditions were worsening, how catastrophe was developing. The requests in December messages became more urgent, became more desperate, became pleas almost. The requests for supplies, that became begging. The reports of airlift inadequacy, that became complaints. The descriptions of conditions, that became cries for help. The military communications, that were becoming desperate communications. The professional requests, that were becoming pleas. The controlled tone, that was breaking, showing desperation beneath. The December messages, that showed transformation, that documented change, that recorded progression, from professional to desperate, from controlled to breaking, from military communications to human pleas. The December messages, that were transition, that showed change, that documented decline. From November professionalism to December desperation, from controlled reports to desperate pleas, from military to human. The December messages, that documented, that recorded, that preserved, the transformation, the decline, the deterioration. The January messages were desperate, were barely controlled, were barely maintaining form. The messages, that reported catastrophic conditions, that described mass starvation, that detailed horrific cold casualties, that listed enormous death toll, that described army that was dying, that was being destroyed, that was ending. The January messages, that were desperate communications, that were pleas for help, that were begging for relief, that were crying for rescue, that showed army was finished, was destroyed, was dying. The messages, that maintained minimal form, that tried to maintain protocol, that tried to maintain professionalism, but that were obviously desperate, obviously pleading, obviously from dying army, from men who were suffering, who were starving, who were freezing, who were dying. The January messages, that were desperate, that were pleas, that were final communications, almost, from army that was ending. The final messages came in late January, in early February, were brief, were simple, were final. The messages, that said situation impossible, resistance ending, surrender imminent. That said ammunition exhausted, rations gone, casualties overwhelming, army destroyed, end near. The final messages, that were last communications, that were final words, that were end of voice. The messages, that maintained some military form, even at end, that gave situation reports, even when situation was death, that communicated professionally, even when communicating end. The final messages, that said clearly, explicitly, without ambiguity, army is destroyed, resistance is ending, surrender is coming, end is here. The final messages, that were sent, that were received, that documented end, that recorded conclusion, that preserved final words, of dying army, of ending force, of destroyed organization. The final messages, that were brief, that were clear, that were final. Then came silence. The radio stopped transmitting. The messages ceased. The communication ended. The silence. That followed final messages. That replaced voice. That replaced presence. That replaced proof of existence. The silence. That was absence. That was void. That was nothing. The static. The empty. Frequency. The lack of signal. The silence, where voice had been, where messages had been, where army had been. The silence, that was more terrible than desperate messages. That was worse than pleas. That was evidence of end. That was proof of death. That was finality. The silence, that came, that remained, that persisted. The radio, that went silent, that stopped transmitting, that marked end, that documented death, that showed army was gone, was finished, was ended. The silence. After the voice, after the messages, after the communications, the silence. That was final. That was complete. That was end. The radio messages documented everything. Documented decline from November to February. Documented deterioration from professional to desperate to silent. Documented transformation from military communications to human pleas to nothing. The messages that were preserved, that were recorded, that exist still, that show how army declined, how situation worsened, how end came. The progression from professional military reports to desperate pleas to silence, from controlled communications to breaking messages to nothing, from presence to absence, from voice to silence, from existence to void. The radio messages, that documented, that recorded, that preserved. The voice of dying army, from beginning to end, from encirclement to silence, from November to February, from 300,000 to silence. The messages, that are evidence, that are documentation, that are record, of catastrophe, of decline, of death. The voice of dying army, that was preserved, that was recorded, that exists in messages, that changed, that deteriorated, that ended, in silence. The radio messages, from Stalingrad, from pocket, from dying army, that documented everything, that recorded decline, that preserved voice, that ended in silence. The voice of dying army, that was documented, that was recorded, that exists still, in preserved messages, in historical record, in evidence, of catastrophe, of Stalingrad, of end. The voice that spoke, that pleaded, that fell silent. The radio messages, that documented everything. The medical situation in a pocket was catastrophic from the beginning, from moment of encirclement, from November 19th, when 300,000 men were trapped. With the medical situation in pocket was catastrophic from the beginning, from moment of encirclement, from November 19th, when 300,000 men were trapped, with limited medical supplies, with inadequate medical facilities, with insufficient medical personnel, for what was coming, for what would happen, for months of casualties, of wounded, of frostbite, of disease. The medical situation that was inadequate from start, that would become catastrophic quickly. That would become horror. The medical situation in pocket at Stalingrad that was catastrophe from beginning. The medical facilities in pocket were inadequate, were improvised, were established in ruins, cellars, basements, damaged buildings, in whatever shelter existed. The hospitals that were not hospitals really, were just places where wounded were gathered, where treatment was attempted, where dying occurred mostly. The facilities that were ruins, that were cold, that were damaged, that had holes in roofs, that had broken windows, that had no heat, that had no proper light, that had no proper equipment, that had nothing. The facilities that were inadequate, primitive, barely functional, that were called hospitals, but that were really just places where wounded came to die. The wounded arrived constantly from the moment of encirclement, arrived from combat, from Soviet attacks, from artillery bombardment, from sniper fire. The wounded that arrived hourly, daily, constantly, that needed treatment, that needed surgery, that needed care, that overwhelmed facilities immediately. The thousands of wounded that accumulated, that filled hospitals, that exceeded capacity instantly, that couldn't all be treated, that couldn't all be cared for, that mostly died. The wounded from combat that were continuous, numerous, that were first wave. Then came frostbite casualties, came in waves, came in thousands. The soldiers who developed frostbite, who had frozen extremities, who needed treatment, who needed amputations, many of them. The frostbite casualties that began in late November, that exploded in December, that became overwhelming in January. The thousands upon thousands who had frostbite, who needed care, who needed amputation, many, who filled hospitals, who overwhelmed facilities, who exceeded capacity completely. The frostbite that required treatment, surgery, amputation, often. That required resources that didn't exist. That required capabilities that weren't there. The medical supplies were critically insufficient from beginning, were inadequate for situation, for number of casualties, for types of injuries, for months of operations. The supplies that were limited, that were in pocket when trap closed, plus what arrived by airlift, which was inadequate, which was fraction of need. The bandages that were never enough. That ran out quickly. That left wounds uncovered. That left bleeding uncontrolled. The morphine that was critically short. That was rationed severely. That was reserved for worst cases. That left many in pain, in agony, in suffering. The antibiotics that were almost non-existent. That were reserved for special cases. That left most without treatment. Left infections untreated. Left wounds to become gangrenous. The anesthesia that was inadequate. That was insufficient for surgeries. That left many operated on with minimal pain relief. The surgeries were performed under conditions that were primitive, terrible, barely functional. The operations conducted in cold rooms, damaged buildings, basements, ruins, with inadequate light, equipment, supplies. The surgeries performed anyway. That were attempted despite conditions. That tried to save lives. That mostly failed. The operations performed without adequate anesthesia, often. That were conducted with minimal pain relief. That left patients conscious. That left them feeling. That left them screaming. The amputations were performed constantly. Were done hourly, daily, continuously. The surgeons who amputated frozen limbs, who removed gangrenous extremities, who cut off frostbitten fingers, toes, feet, hands, arms, legs, who removed dead tissue, who tried to save lives, who tried to prevent gangrene from spreading, who performed amputation after amputation after amputation, the amputations that were necessary, that were life-saving sometimes, that were performed under terrible conditions, without adequate anesthesia, without adequate pain relief, with patients screaming, suffering, feeling everything. The surgeons who worked constantly, who performed amputations endlessly, who tried to save lives, who often failed, who watched patients die anyway from shock, blood loss, infection, complications. The screaming in field hospitals was constant, unending, was evidence of suffering, horror, catastrophe. The wounded who screamed from pain, who screamed during surgery, who screamed from fear, who screamed from suffering, the screaming that was sound of field hospitals, that was evidence of inadequate anesthesia, of insufficient pain relief, of surgery on conscious patients, the screaming that was constant, unending, terrible. That was evidence of medical catastrophe. The hospital conditions made everything worse, made recovery impossible, made infection inevitable, made death likely. The buildings that were ruins, cold that had no heat. The wounded who lay in freezing rooms, who had inadequate blankets, who suffered from cold while suffering from wounds, who endured double agony. The conditions that made recovery impossible, that made healing unlikely, that made survival improbable. The cold that slowed healing, that made wounds worse, that made infections more likely, that made death more certain. The infections were universal, inevitable, were product of conditions, of inadequate sterility, of primitive environment, of lack of antibiotics. The wounded who developed infections, all of them almost, whose wounds became infected, who developed sepsis, gangrene. The infections that couldn't be prevented, that couldn't be controlled, that couldn't be treated adequately without antibiotics. The infections that spread, that consumed tissue, that caused gangrene, sepsis, that killed. The infections that killed more than wounds themselves, that killed majority of wounded eventually. The typhus epidemic began in January, started in hospitals, spread rapidly. The typhus that was product of conditions, of overcrowding, of lack of sanitation, of lice, of cold. The typhus that was inevitable, that spread through hospitals, through units, through pocket, that infected thousands, that sickened thousands, that killed thousands. The typhus that was additional catastrophe, that was additional horror, that was additional killing beyond wounds, frostbite, starvation. The typhus epidemic that began in January, that spread rapidly, that killed thousands. The doctors were overwhelmed, helpless mostly, were watching men die, were unable to save, were unable to help. The doctors who worked constantly, who tried desperately, who did everything possible, who failed mostly, who couldn't save, who couldn't treat adequately, who couldn't provide proper care, who watched wounded die, who watched infections kill, who watched typhus spread, who were helpless. Because of conditions, because of lack of supplies, because of inadequate facilities. The doctors who were traumatized, who were broken, who were destroyed psychologically by helplessness, by inability to save, by watching suffering they couldn't relieve, by seeing death they couldn't prevent. The medical catastrophe killed tens of thousands, through wounds that couldn't be treated, through frostbite that required amputation, through infections that couldn't be controlled, through typhus that couldn't be stopped, through conditions that prevented healing, through lack of supplies that prevented treatment. The deaths that were product of medical catastrophe, of inadequate care, of impossible conditions, the deaths that numbered tens of thousands, that were from wounds, frostbite, infection, disease, lack of treatment, inadequate care. The deaths that were evidence, documentation, record of horror, suffering, catastrophe. That was medical situation in pocket at Stalingrad. Winter of 1942 to 43. The medical catastrophe. January 1943 was the final month. Was month of death. Was month of ending. Was month when everything came together, when all catastrophes combined. When all suffering accumulated, when all horror concentrated, when dying became universal, when resistance became futile, when end became inevitable. January, the month, when cold was coldest, when hunger was worst, when disease was epidemic, when combat was fiercest, when dying was everywhere, when armies ceased to function, when organization broke down, when end came. January, the final month, the last weeks, the ending of German 6th Army at Stalingrad, the final month, January. The cold in January was extreme, was coldest of winter, was -30 regularly, was -40 on worst days. The temperature, that was extreme, that was deadly, that was killing constantly. The soldiers, who were exposed, who had inadequate clothing, who had no proper shelter, who were freezing continuously, who were developing frostbite universally, who were dying from cold daily. The cold in January. That was worst. That was most extreme. That was most deadly. That combined with everything else. With hunger, with weakness, with exhaustion, with disease. To kill, to destroy, to end. The cold. That was extreme. That was deadly. That was killing. In January, in final month, the rations in January were starvation level, were barely sustaining life, were insufficient for anything. The soldiers, who received perhaps 200 calories daily, sometimes less, sometimes none. The rations, that were gone mostly, that were exhausted, that were insufficient. The horses, that were gone, that had been consumed, that left nothing. The airlift, that was still inadequate, that was still delivering fraction of need. That was leaving soldiers starving, the rations in January. That was starvation, that were killing, that were making soldiers skeletal, that were reducing men to walking corpses, that were destroying combat capability, that were ending army, through hunger, through starvation, through slow death. The rations, that were starvation level, that were killing thousands, that were destroying army. In January, in final month. The Soviet forces intensified operations in January, began final elimination of pocket, began systematic destruction of trapped army. The Soviet attacks, that came daily, that were relentless, that were systematic, that reduced German-held territory, that compressed pocket, that concentrated trapped forces, that made everything worse. The Soviet offensive, that began in early January, that was designed to eliminate pocket, to destroy Sixth Army, to finish what encirclement began. The offensive, that was powerful, that was overwhelming, that was systematic, that reduced pocket steadily, that compressed space gradually, that concentrated suffering progressively. The Soviet operations, that were final elimination, that were systematic destruction, that were ending of Sixth Army, of pocket, of everything. The pocket shrank steadily, under Soviet pressure, under systematic attacks, under relentless offensive. The pocket, that had been 50 kilometers wide, became 40, became 30, became 20, became smaller. The space, that concentrated, that compressed, that made everything worse. The 300,000 men who had been spread across 2,000 square kilometers were compressed, were concentrated, were packed together in shrinking space, in diminishing area, in pocket that became smaller, that became tighter, that became more concentrated. The pocket that shrank, that compressed, that concentrated suffering, that made everything worse, that made dying more concentrated, that made end more certain. The shrinking, the compressing, the concentrating, that occurred in January. That was Soviet offensive. That was elimination of pocket. That was systematic destruction of Sixth Army, of trapped men, of everything. The combat continued despite everything, despite starvation, despite cold, despite hopelessness, despite knowing end was inevitable. The German soldiers, who still fought, who still defended positions, who still resisted, who still followed orders, who still did duty, despite everything, despite suffering, despite dying, despite knowing they were doomed. The combat, that was remarkable, that was testament to discipline, to training, to duty, to German military culture, to something. The soldiers, who fought when hope was gone, when rescue was impossible, when survival was unlikely, when death was certain, who fought anyway, who defended positions, who resisted attacks, who followed orders, who did duty until they couldn't, until strength was gone, until ammunition was exhausted, until end came. The combat, that continued, that persisted, that lasted, until final moment, until surrender, until end. The remarkable resistance, the continued fighting, the persistent combat, despite everything, despite hopelessness, despite doom. The soldiers, who fought, who resisted, who endured, until end. The discipline held remarkably well. Held when everything else was breaking, when organization was collapsing, when army was dying. The discipline, that kept men in positions, that kept them following orders, that kept them fighting, that kept them functioning. Despite everything, despite suffering, despite dying. The discipline, that was German military training, that was product of system, that was remarkable. That was what kept army functioning, such as it functioned, until very end. The discipline, that held, that maintained, that persisted. When everything else failed, when hope was gone, when relief didn't come, when supplies didn't arrive, when men were starving, when men were freezing, when men were dying, the discipline, that held, that kept army together, that maintained organization, that enabled continued resistance, until very end, until surrender, until conclusion. The discipline, that was remarkable. That was testament, that was evidence of German military culture, of training, of system, that created this, that maintained this, that kept discipline, even in catastrophe, even in horror, even in dying. The discipline, that held, The casualties in January were catastrophic, were worst of entire siege. The deaths, that numbered thousands daily, that were from everything, from cold, from hunger, from disease, from combat, from wounds, from infections, from typhus, from everything. The dying, that was universal, that was everywhere, that was constant. The casualties, that reduced army rapidly, that destroyed force systematically, that made end inevitable. The deaths in January, that were from starvation primarily, that killed thousands, from cold, that killed thousands, from disease, that killed thousands, from typhus epidemic, that killed thousands, from combat, that killed thousands, from wounds and infections, that killed thousands. The dying, that was everywhere, that was everyone, that was constant. The casualties, that were catastrophic, that destroyed army, that made end certain. The dying in January, the deaths, the casualties, that numbered tens of thousands, that reduced force catastrophically, that ended army, that made surrender inevitable. The casualties in January, in final month. The conditions deteriorated beyond anything previously experienced. The cold was coldest. The hunger was worst. The disease was most widespread. The combat was most intense. The suffering was most extreme. The dying was most prevalent. Everything that was worst. In January, in final month, the conditions, that combined, that concentrated, that accumulated, that made suffering most extreme, made dying most widespread, made catastrophe most complete. The conditions in January, that were worst, that were most extreme, that were most terrible, that were culmination, that were concentration, that were accumulation, of everything, of all suffering, of all horror, of all catastrophe. That occurred since November, that accumulated over months, that concentrated in January, in final month, in ending, the conditions, that were worst ever, that were most extreme, that were culmination, of catastrophe, of horror, of Stalingrad. The soldiers were barely human by January, were skeletons, were barely alive, were walking corpses. The soldiers, who weighed perhaps 30 kilograms, who could barely walk, who could barely stand, who were skin and bones, who had no strength, who had no capability, who were barely surviving, who were dying, the soldiers who were covered in lice, who were dirty, who were diseased, who were wounded, who were frostbitten, who were suffering, beyond description, beyond imagination, beyond what humans should endure. The soldiers in January, who were barely human, who were barely alive, who were evidence of catastrophe, of suffering, of horror. That was Stalingrad, that was Pocket, that was January. The soldiers, who were barely surviving, who were mostly dying, who were evidence of horror, of catastrophe, of what war does, what siege does, what starvation does, what cold does, what everything does, to humans, to soldiers, to men, the soldiers in January, who were barely human, who were barely alive, who were ending, who were dying, who were evidence of catastrophe. The organization began breaking down in January. The army, that had maintained structure, that had maintained function, that had maintained discipline, began breaking. The chain of command, that was degrading, the communication, that was failing, the control, that was loosening, the organization, that was dissolving, the army, that was ceasing to be army, that was becoming collection of dying men, that was losing organization, losing structure, losing function, the breakdown, that was progressive, that was inevitable, that was product of conditions, of casualties, of suffering, of dying. The organization that broke down, that dissolved, that ended, in January, in final weeks, when army ceased to be army, became collection of suffering, of dying, of ending, the breakdown, of organization, of structure, of army. That occurred in January, in final month, in ending. January was culmination, was concentration, was accumulation of everything, of all catastrophes, of all suffering, of all horror. January, when cold was coldest, when hunger was worst, when disease was epidemic, when dying was universal, when resistance was ending, when army was ending, when everything was ending. January 1943. Final month, last week's, ending, of German 6th Army, at Stalingrad, in pocket, the final month. That was January. That was culmination. That was concentration. That was accumulation. That was ending of everything. January, the final month, the last weeks, the ending. January 31st, 1943. Final day of effective resistance. Final day of functioning army. Final day before surrender. The day when Hitler made decision, made promotion, made gesture. That was message. That was instruction. That was manipulation. That was pressure. Without being explicit order, the promotion of Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal, to highest rank in German military, to position that carried tradition, that carried expectation, that carried meaning, that said something, that meant something, that was pressure. The promotion, January 31st, by Hitler, of Paulus to Field Marshal, that was message, that was instruction, that expected death. The Field Marshal rank carried history, carried tradition, carried pride, was highest rank in German military, was pinnacle, was ultimate achievement, was honor, was recognition, was position held by few, by most capable, by most honored. The Field Marshals, who were elite, who were best, who were honored, who carried tradition, who maintained honor, who upheld standards. The Field Marshal rank, that had history, that had tradition, that had meaning, beyond just rank, beyond just position, beyond just honor. The rank, that carried expectations, that carried traditions, that carried history, that mattered. The Field Marshal rank, that meant something, that was significant, that was important. Beyond military function, beyond tactical position, the rank that carried weight, of history, of tradition, of expectation. The tradition was specific, was clear, was maintained throughout German military history. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Ever. Not one. Not in all of German military history. Through all wars, through all defeats, through everything. No field marshal had surrendered, had given up, had been captured. The field marshals, who died in battle, who fell leading troops, who chose death over capture, who maintained honor, who kept tradition, who upheld standards, the tradition that was unbroken, that was maintained, that was sacred, that was part of what field marshal meant, part of what rank carried, part of obligation, of responsibility, of expectation. No field marshal had ever surrendered. Was tradition, was history, was expectation, was what rank meant. The tradition that was centuries old, that was maintained always, that was unbroken, that was what Hitler was invoking, that was what promotion meant, that was message, that was instruction. Don't surrender. Die instead. Maintain tradition. Keep honor. Uphold history. Hitler knew the tradition, understood the meaning. The promotion was deliberate, was calculated, was manipulation, was message without being order. The promotion that said to Paulus, "You are now field marshal." Field marshals have tradition, have history, have expectations. No field marshal has ever surrendered. You know what this means. You know what is expected. You know what honor requires, what tradition demands, what history expects. The promotion, that was telling Paulus, die, kill yourself, choose death, maintain tradition, keep honor, don't surrender, don't give up, don't be captured, don't be first field marshal to surrender, die instead. The promotion, that was manipulation, that was pressure, That was psychological. That was Hitler's way of ordering death without ordering explicitly, of commanding suicide without commanding directly, of expecting death through tradition, through honor, through promotion. The promotion, that was message. That was instruction. That was manipulation. That expected death. That demanded death. That was designed to ensure Paulus would die, would kill himself, would not surrender. Paulus received the promotion by radio, was informed, was told, was promoted to Field Marshal, in basement of Wehrmacht, in headquarters, in pocket, in final hours. Received message. Received promotion, understood message. Knew what it meant, understood what Hitler expected, what tradition demanded, what honor required. The pressure, that was enormous, that was overwhelming, that was final burden. Added to everything, added to months of suffering, added to responsibility for 300,000 men, added to catastrophe, added to horror, the pressure to die, to kill himself, to maintain tradition, to keep honor, to uphold history, to not surrender, to not give up, to not be first field marshal to surrender. The pressure, that was final burden, final weight, final demand. On Paulus, on field marshal, on man who commanded dying army, who was responsible for 300,000 dying men, who was watching catastrophe, who was presiding over horror, the pressure to die rather than surrender, to choose death rather than life, to maintain tradition rather than save men. The pressure, that was enormous, that was final, that was Hitler's final manipulation, final order, final demand, through promotion, through tradition, through honor, the pressure on Paulus to die. But Paulus made different choice. Made choice that broke tradition, that violated expectation, that ignored manipulation, made choice to live, to surrender, to give up, to be captured, to become first field marshal to surrender, to break centuries of tradition, to violate honor code, to ignore expectation, made choice that saved 91,000 lives, temporarily, that ended suffering in pocket, temporarily, that stopped dying in Stalingrad, temporarily, made choice to surrender rather than die, to live rather than kill himself, to save men rather than maintain tradition, to choose humanity over honor, to choose life over death, to choose reality over tradition. The choice. That was conscious. That was deliberate. That was difficult. That broke everything. That violated everything. That ignored everything. That Hitler expected. That tradition demanded. That honor required. The choice to surrender, to live, to save, to be first, to break tradition, to violate honor, to ignore expectation. The choice that Paulus made. February 1st, when Soviet soldiers entered basement, when army was finished, when resistance was ending, when choice had to be made. The choice to surrender, to live, to save 91,000 men, to be first field marshal to surrender, to break tradition, to violate honor, to make new history. The choice. That was made. That was conscious, that was deliberate, that defined Paulus, that saved thousands, that broke centuries of tradition. Hitler's reaction was fury, was rage, was sense of betrayal. The Führer, who expected death, who expected suicide, who expected tradition maintained, who received news of surrender, of capitulation, of field marshal captured, was furious, was enraged, was betrayed in his view. The field marshal, who didn't do what was expected, who didn't follow tradition, who didn't maintain honor, who didn't kill himself, who surrendered instead, who chose life, who chose to save men, who chose differently than Hitler expected, than tradition demanded, than honor required. Hitler, who felt betrayed, who felt insulted, who felt Paulus had failed, had dishonored, had violated, Everything, the fury, that was immediate, that was intense, that was permanent. Hitler, who never forgave Paulus, who never understood choice, who never accepted surrender, who saw it as betrayal, as dishonor, as violation, as failure. The fury, that lasted, that remained, that was permanent, that was Hitler's response to choice, to surrender, to life that Paulus chose. But the choice saved 91,000 lives. Temporarily, saved them from dying in pocket, from starving, from freezing, from being killed in final assaults, from dying in Stalingrad. Gave them chance, however slim, however temporary, however unlikely. Gave them possibility of survival, of returning home, of living. Eventually, the choice. That ended suffering in pocket, that stopped dying there, that saved lives there, that gave chance to 91,000 men. The choice that most would die anyway, in captivity, in camps, in Soviet hands. That only 5,000 would return, would survive, would come home. But the choice. That made that possible, that enabled that survival, that gave that chance. To 5,000, to those who returned. Eventually, the choice. That saved them, that enabled their survival, that made possible their return, however distant, however unlikely, however few. The choice. That saved, that gave chance, that made possible the survival of 5,000 from 300,000. The choice to surrender rather than die, to save rather than maintain tradition, to choose life over honor, to choose humanity over pride, to choose reality over expectation. The choice that Paulus made. January 31st, February 1st, when promoted, when expected to die, when chose to live, when chose to surrender, when chose to save, when broke tradition, when violated honor, when became first. Field Marshal to surrender. The choice. That was made, that mattered, that saved, that defined. Paulus, the man, the Field Marshal, the commander, who chose to surrender, to save, to live, the promotion, the choice, the tradition broken, the lives saved, the decision that was made. January 31st, February 1st, 1943, at Stalingrad, in pocket, in basement of Wehrmacht. When Paulus was promoted, was pressured, was expected to die, chose to live, chose to surrender, chose to save, the promotion and the choice. The ruins of Stalingrad stand now as memorial, as monument, as evidence of what occurred there, of battle that was fought, of catastrophe that unfolded. The city that was rebuilt, that rose from ruins, that is now Volgograd. But that was Stalingrad, that was site of catastrophe. That was place where 300,000 men were trapped, where 295,000 died, where 5,000 survived, where greatest catastrophe of war occurred. The city that stands as memorial, as evidence, as reminder of what happened, of what war does, of what siege means, of what catastrophe is. The German Sixth Army ceased to exist, was destroyed, was annihilated, was ended. The army that had been powerful, that had been effective, that had conquered much, was destroyed completely. At Stalingrad, in pocket, in 3 months, in winter, the destruction, that was total, that was complete, that was catastrophic. The army that ceased to exist, that was eliminated, that was annihilated, at Stalingrad, in 1942 and 43. In winter, in pocket, in catastrophe. The Sixth Army, that was destroyed, that is gone. That ended at Stalingrad. The turning point came at Stalingrad. The battle, that changed war, that changed perceptions, that changed everything. The German defeat, that showed Wehrmacht was not invincible, that showed Germany could be defeated, that showed Hitler's strategy was flawed. The defeat, that was decisive, that was significant, that was turning point, that began Germany's decline, that started long retreat, that initiated path to defeat, Stalingrad. That was turning point, was decisive battle, was a moment when war changed, when Germany began losing, when defeat became possible, when end began. Stalingrad. That changed everything. That was turning point. That was decisive. That mattered. Strategically, psychologically, historically. Stalingrad. That changed war. That changed world. That was turning point. But Stalingrad was more than strategic, was more than tactical, was more than turning point, was human catastrophe, was suffering on enormous scale, was death that numbered hundreds of thousands, was conditions that tested limits of endurance, was horror that shocked even those who witnessed much. Stalingrad. That was human catastrophe. That was suffering. That was death. On scale. That is difficult to comprehend. That is hard to imagine. That is almost impossible to grasp. Stalingrad. That was not just battle, was catastrophe, was horror, was suffering, was death. For hundreds of thousands, for 300,000 trapped, for 295,000 who died, for 5,000 who survived. Stalingrad. That was human catastrophe. That was horror. That was suffering beyond description. The story told here was about dying, was about suffering, was about catastrophe, was about last hours that were months, was about 300,000 men trapped, was about cold that killed, hunger that killed, disease that killed, conditions that killed, was about promise that was false, relief that failed, hope that died, army that ended. Was about 91,000 who surrendered, 86,000 who died in captivity, 5,000 who returned. Was about arithmetic, of catastrophe, of death, of dying. That numbered 295,000. From 300,000 was about survival rate. That was less than 2%. Was about death rate. That was more than 98%. The story that was told, that was documented, that was preserved. In history, in numbers, in evidence, in testimony of those who were there, who survived, who remembered, who told. The story of last hours of German 6th Army at Stalingrad. The story that is difficult, that is terrible, that is necessary to tell, to remember, to understand. Rest now. The story is told. The numbers are clear. The arithmetic is complete. The catastrophe is documented. The last hours. That were months. The dying. That was progressive. The catastrophe. That was Stalingrad. Is told. Is documented. Is remembered. Here. The 300,000 who entered pocket. The 295,000 who died. The 5,000 who survived. Are remembered. Are documented. Are told. Their story, their suffering, their dying, their catastrophe is told here, is preserved here, is remembered here. The last hours of German 6th Army at Stalingrad, winter of 1942 to 43. The catastrophe, the horror, the dying, the arithmetic, that is simple, that is brutal, that is clear. 300,000, 295,000, 5,000, the numbers, that tell story, that show scope, that demonstrate catastrophe, that are arithmetic, of Stalingrad, of last hours, of German 6th Army, the story that is told, that is complete, that is finished. Rest now, the arithmetic of catastrophe is complete.